the practicality of composing with strings. Now, the thing about Audio Imperial Nucleus is that this library is slightly cheaper because it comes with strings ensembles, right? We don't have a patch where we can play with the violins and then another we can play only with the cellos. It's everything together. But depending on what range you're writing in the, the octaves here, you're gonna use certain instruments or others. So the main instruments in the string section is like violins, which are the highest ones. Then there's the violas, which are, here they're blended with violins. Less sharp, a bit more somber, they have a bit more body. Then there's the cellos, which are the, which in Nucleus, they're kind of blended with the double basses. And then there's the double basses, the lowest of the gang. What you may have noticed is that as we went deeper and deeper, especially with the double basses, it seemed like the volume went down, but actually, as I said before, the higher notes tend to be the most noticeable. Like, an instrument that plays on very high octaves like this is like a kid screaming or crying. Like, it's super loud. Like, it's such a high-pitched sound that your ear will hear it. It's not as uncomfortable, obviously, as a screaming kid. I'm not saying that at all. Violins are beautiful. But, when you write music, it's important to know that the highest notes are the ones that stand out, especially when you're writing for an ensemble, like a string ensemble. Now, knowing all this stuff and these instruments, let's take those chords from the piano from before and copy-paste them on this strings patch from Nucleus. This is what beginners would do. They would take like a chord progression, copy-paste, let's go. And, listen. Now I may tell you this actually doesn't sound good. And you may be like, what? It does. It sounds real. What do you mean it doesn't sound good? I remember how it felt for me when I, bought my first string libraries and stuff, and I just did stuff like this. I'm like, yo, what the hell? I felt so elated. But now as someone who's a bit more, skilled, I recognize the flaws in this. And I'm gonna talk about that. If you want to write realistically for sustained, long emotional strings like this, then I recommend that you approach the chord progression writing a bit differently. What I personally like to do is I take each of the voices of our chords. So this is like the bass voice, right? These notes here, bass voice. And then there's these voices in the middle. I take each of them and I will start working on them independently. So this. I will start working on it and be like, we could probably, the notes that are touching like this, we could probably unite them into a single note or something like that. And you can start giving different rhythms to the notes, leaving some holes sometimes. So that line from before became this. And just leaps higher. So I like to just do that, like rewrite this line by itself and make sure that it sounds good by itself. And then I'll take the next line in my chord progression or something like that. This is how it was before, but I'll change it. So I'll, make some notes end slightly before or start slightly later or just move them independently. So now we get this. Something like that. That sounds nicer, right? Compared to having like ba 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 ba, like this blocks chord, like just And here I don't really follow rules personally. I just go and follow my heart. I go to taste, But it's good when you just let the voice be independent from each other a little bit. So after I did a bit of that with every single voice. And by the way, you can help yourself using the ghost notes tricks that I showed before. After I did that with every single voice, I got this now. That's much nicer. Why is this important? Well, because in a string ensemble, when you mean string ensemble, you mean like, I don't know, 40, 50, 60, or even 20 string players, like many people, right? There's many people playing these string instruments. It's very unlikely that they will all start notes on the same time and end them at the same time. It's very likely instead that the composer would tell you four, play this long, you other four play this long, like it's different rhythms, different duration, like chaining together to create something that feels like multiple melodies playing together, kind of, but it actually still is just a chord progression. These are the notes belonging to a chord progression for the most part. So think like rewriting each note in each voice in our chords independently from the other is a good thing to do. You just have to experiment with this and go to taste. The more music you end up writing, the more it will make sense. But that's not all. It still doesn't sound as human, I think. The reason for it is these notes I just played, they always have the same freaking intensity. So let's talk about something. Say you have this chord. Or this. I mean, it's nice. I think this is a modulation, I'm not sure. But it's nice, right? But it sounds so stale. Let's actually make it a bit nicer. This thing you're seeing here is the MIDI controller that I'm using in FL Studio. It's called BRSO Articulate, which I recommend to use to any person who uses FL Studio. Depending on what DAW you're using, you're gonna have different ways to control, the MIDI channel that is linked to your library. This is something that we're gonna link resources about because it's a bit complex to explain in a video like this. But normally on a MIDI controller, you have different parameters. One of them is MIDI CC 1, which is the modulation wheel. In each or most orchestral libraries, the long notes, like the sustained notes, their intensity is linked to the modulation wheel. So when I move this parameter, notice what happens. Let's play this again. It kind of feels like a volume slider, right? But it's not exactly that. What the modulation wheel does, or the dynamics parameter in the library, because that's, this is the parameter that is changing. This changes the way in which the bow on the string is played. Like when the dynamics parameter or modulation wheel is high, they're like the string players are playing like with a lot of power, right? When it's low, they're playing super soft. And of course, that changes the volume that is perceived, but it actually changes also the sound. It's more round, it's more soft. And so the best thing you can do when you're composing for long strings, sustained strings and stuff like that, is to give them life by actually drawing curves for the dynamics parameter or the modulation wheel parameter, And basically, the strings are gonna follow the curves that you draw in terms of intensity. This applies for sustained sounds in orchestral libraries, for the most part. You can also record the modulation wheel yourself. If you have a keyboard, normally they have a modulation wheel, and you can start the record function on your DAW and then play the music and then move the modulation wheel to record a performance. It's like you're a composer conducting, kind of. Now that we did the beautiful embellishments with making the voices independent of each other, I also recorded or drew these dynamic movements for the modulation wheel. And when you put everything together, from this ugly duckling that we started from, we get this. And by the way, there's not a technique to use here. This is to taste. For example, there's been many shifts here that are so sudden, and maybe that wouldn't be very realistic. People wouldn't play with such sudden shifts. But, this is something you want to write to taste. And I spent so much time moving these freaking curve parameters all the time because this determines the performance. So you're on one side, you're telling the computer which notes to play. Then you tell the computer, oh, play them in this order with these disparate rhythms and whatever. And then you tell the computer what intensity you want the notes to be played in. And that's how you get the human effect. Another thing you may notice is that, the notes were way more clanky before, like perfectly on the grid. But actually, when you write for strings, you want them, because it's a big ensemble, many people, they're gonna have different rhythms, right? Some people may start a few milliseconds before, others may stop playing a few milliseconds after, or whatever, for each note. So for each note, you kind of want to move it slightly, make it a bit blurred. That's the best way to go about it. You have to create a bit of the human error by force, so to speak. And then, when you take that and you put the melody on top, you get this. And one thing you may have noticed just now is that there's one MIDI track with the chords, but then I open another MIDI track just for the melody. This enables me to have different dynamic curves for the chords and the melody. Maybe I want the melody to be played loudly with a lot of emphasis and strength on the bow, so I'll keep the dynamics high for the melody, and for the chord, they're slightly lower. So that's also something you want to keep in mind. You can also just put them on the same, MIDI channel, but then you won't be able to treat their dynamic levels differently. So that's my reasoning for having two separate layers here. When you're writing music as an expert with a library that is a bit more expensive and more capable in this, you may want to do, one line for each type of instrument. You may have a double basses ensemble and do these lower lines only for that ensemble. You may have a violin ensemble and do this high line for that. A cello ensemble that does the middle lines. So that is actually the best way to go about it. But doing it with a string ensemble like this, it's easy, it's fast, and it gives you a strong, like a powerful sound. Because for each note that you play in a string ensemble patch, if it's a string ensemble of 60 players, each note is like 60 players playing that note. So if you have 4, it's like 60 multiplied by 4, which is insane. Like 4 notes at the same time. So that's why string ensemble patches are hugely sounding. They sound huge. But that's the basics of how to write for sustained strings.